Hello, my friends. I'm back with another candlelit midweek session of the Romanov Dynasty of Russia. We're still in the 17th century, and I've still got my Swiss memorial candles, so I guess you can see them flickering in my glasses. All right. Yes, I enjoy doing this in the darkness, and it makes me think of that old children's, the old nursery rhyme. I don't remember the exact words. How far is it to Babylon? 60 miles and 10. Can I get there by candlelight? Yes, and back again. If your feet are nimble and light, you can get there by candlelight. And I always thought as a child that meant that you would walk with a candle or a torch or something in your hand in the darkness, but I'm told that no, it actually was just saying that you could get there in daylight before candles were lit in the evening. So it was a little disappointing. I've always liked thinking about that night journey to Babylon. All right, so today's topic is a very martial one, and we've talked about the spiritual isn't the right word, but the sort of religious role of the Romanov tsars and the Romanov mythos, especially with the meek and pious Michael the First, or Michael the Only, who never played an active military role in Muscovy. And so I've got some martial things here. I've got an old papacha. If you've watched my other videos on Grand Duke Dimitri's diaries, you've already seen this. This is a Cossack's hat, and it's made of Astrakhan wool. And I don't think, let's see, Ivan the Terrible made it to the Sea of Azov. I don't know how far into Central Asia Russia had reached by that time. So I don't know if, and as far as no, there weren't any Cossacks yet. Yeah, we'll have to get back to that interesting topic. And oddly enough, when I was doing the 1906 diary entry for Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich today, I was talking about toy soldiers, because even though he was 14 years old and felt that it was shameful and that he should have outgrown it, he was still playing with toy soldiers. And so I dug up some of my old toy soldiers. And it's kind of ironic, because I came to sit down and do this today, and here were my toy soldiers. I had not only left them on the porch table, but I had set them up on top of this brilliant book on the Russian Civil War with, you can see, that's General Wrangel in front. Yeah, so I guess it's as good a day as any to talk about the military thread, the military motif within the Romanov mythos. And I don't know if you could say it was part of the mythos yet, but Michael made sure that his son Alexei had toys, had toy weapons. And Michael also started the tradition that any Romanov boy, when he turned 1 on his first birthday, would get a little toy horse, a little toy military horse. And there's some speculation that was because that was to remember the Romanovs' boyar heritage. So the boyars were the landowners, the servitors of the Tsar, and they were responsible for providing troops, for providing a militia from their own serfs whenever the Tsar needed that. So what countries at this time, if we're talking about, the early towards the end of the 17th century, which countries in Europe had standing armies? I should have looked that up before I dived into this today, because I don't actually know. Russia did not have a standing army. Maybe, you know, some of the most powerful states at that time were, for instance, Sweden. Sweden probably had a standing army, but I don't know. Did England have a standing army? Yeah. That's an interesting question. If any of you know about that and could comment on it, that would be terrific. But Russia did not have a standing army. Russia had these boyar militias. And yeah, in fact, the boyars, the landowning in Russia was at that time tied into service to the Tsar. Not service to the state, service to the Tsar, because the state was only an emanation of the Tsar. And so you had as much land as the crown would give you land in proportion to the number of serfs that you were willing to train and arm to be militiamen when the emperor, or there were no emperors yet, when the Tsar needed them. And so your land holding was based on this. And if you were no longer able or willing to perform that service, then those lands would be taken away from you. And there were some inherited lands, but they were small compared to these lands that were more or less not your property, but granted for your use by the Tsar, so that you could support a militia group. And these were mostly horsemen. You know, the stationary troops were not very effective against the Mongols and the Tatars, who were incredible horsemen and mounted soldiers, mounted archers. Anyway, we will talk later about these little sort of peasant slash soldier groups like the Streltsy that were supported directly by the crown, that didn't belong. They were peasants, but they didn't belong to landowners. They weren't serfs. And they were not a standing army, but they were always available. They were always drilled. And so they were kind of this in-between group of people. And that's what essentially Cossacks would be. Cossacks were also peasant soldiers. They most of the year they did farming, but they were required to maintain a certain amount of military training and to always be available if the need arose. But that comes much later. So Mikhail gave his son this little toy horse on his first birthday and gave him toy weapons. So mainly bow and arrow and sword, you know, weapons that were already starting to be out of date. You know, you weren't going to get anywhere at this time with just armed men with bows and arrows and swords. There were already firearms. And in fact, the Streltsy used muskets, I think. They used primitive firearms of some kind. But anyway, by the next generation, so Mikhail's son, Alexei doesn't get as much credit as he should for having been really the forerunner to what Peter did. Alexei was a broad-minded person. He was interested in modernization. One of the modernizations he carried out was really disastrous, which was to try to bring Muscovite Orthodox practice into line with Greek Orthodox practice. And it was disastrous not because it was the wrong thing to do. I'm not going to make a value judgment about that. I mean, he didn't want, I'm sure, the two churches to drift apart. He wanted them to remain the same church, and they would have drifted apart. But it was disastrous in that it produced this raskol, this schism. The Russian word is raskol, and that's where the old believers come from. But that wasn't what I was going to talk about today. I just want to make the point that he was a modernizing man, to a lesser extent than his son Peter. Peter would really be his father's son and then some, his father's son on steroids when it came to the whole modernizing thing. Whereas Peter's other two older brothers, the eldest brother, also named Alexei, died, but Peter's his surviving two brothers, Fyodor and Ivan, were very much in the mold of the pious and meek Tsar. But, of course, if there were going to be Grand Dukes, and if there was going to be a Tsar on the throne, then they were the defenders of the Orthodox faith. And so it would have been impractical not to bring up the next generation of Romanovs with an understanding of things military. And so with Alexei, with his children, he gave them the boys got the usual swords and bows and arrows, and they received training in the traditional military arts of that time, which were horsemanship, archery, and swordsmanship. But they also you started to see more modern military toys creeping into the nursery. So they had drums and they had cannon. And Alexei himself imported and had translated books on Western military science. So those were in his library, and he died long before Peter came to the throne. But if he'd survived, then I'm sure he could have introduced Peter to those books, and Peter would have absolutely adored that. Okay, so Alexei, amongst the other reforms, he did recognize the strong need for military reform. And in that day and age, it was the crown, it was the Tsar that was pushing that forward. And it was the boyars, even though they were supposed to be the absolute servants and slaves of the Tsar, who were resisting it. Just the way, in later years, when you had liberal modernizing landlords out in the countryside, and they would try to introduce things like threshing machines imported from England, the peasants would destroy them because they weren't interested in that. They weren't interested in leaving the old traditional ways behind. And so the same with the boyars. They maybe even were starting to see the writing on the wall with this new Tsar who was interested in innovations and were afraid that they would become redundant. Anyway, they were not, so all of the impetus for military reform was at this point coming from the throne. And in fact, the boyars considered the professional military service to be socially degrading. And that's a quote from an excellent book. I really can't justifiably read that quote, but I forgot to write down how could you, William? I forgot to write down the name. Here it is. So this is a very, very good book by Richard Helly called Encirclement and Military Change in Muscovy, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1971. And you can't go wrong with that book, even though it's, how old is it now? It's like 50 years old. Still, it's a classic. So, yeah, they were... the idea of being a professional officer was terribly déclassé. If you were a boyar, you were sort of a wild, fierce warrior, but who was ready, as a servitor of the Tsar, but you weren't they didn't have a conception of the middle class, but they did have a increasing conception of an administrative class, and some aspects of professional military activity were coming into play, and the boyars just wanted nothing to do with that, because for them it was humiliating, and they would prefer, if their militias were not enough, they would prefer the crown to hire foreign mercenaries to augment the indigenous militia. Okay, but under the Romanovs, actually, things started improving in some ways for the boyars, because this law, there had been a law that was passed in 1556 tying the amount of land that any boyar could control really explicitly and legally, not just by custom, with their obligation to the throne to provide armed men. But under the Romanovs, that began to lapse, and more of the boyars' lands were not land grants, but were hereditary lands, or the land grants were starting to be passed from one generation to another, or as before, the Tsar could at any time have taken land from, Boyar Shwisky and transferred it to Boyar Ivanov, because it was, he was, everything was an emanation of him. And that began to fall out of practice. And I guess, Alexei, I guess the Tsars were sort of turning a blind eye to the increasing, the increase of boyars passing their lands, not legally, but passing their lands on to their heirs as hereditary lands. And in fact, it lapsed to the point that the law finally caught up to it. And in 1677, the law was abolished. So was that good for the boyars? Well, yes and no. It was good for them in the short term, I guess. But it was sort of the writing was on the wall. Things were going to change. The old system was not going to continue into the future. So it's the old adage, be careful what you wish for. Because it was, if this changes, then other things are going to change as well. So why am I talking about all this? Well, because it is so absolutely crucial to Grand Ducal role in the future centuries when there would be Grand Dukes. It was really crucial. Not so much the way the system worked back in the 17th century, but the conflicting ideas of what service to the Tsar meant, and what was in keeping with the dignity of servitors. And who did they serve? Did they serve the Tsar, or did they serve the state? Okay, so this is really important groundwork that we're laying here, and hopefully I'll be able to do another video on Saturday. I feel like the last one was kind of disastrous. I was just not in the right state of mind, and I was rambling so much. And this one, at least, has been a little more focused, but I'll try to keep that up. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.